Our next speaker was the senior advisor in the Hillary Clinton for President campaign. She was also the director of communications for President Bill Clinton. As the national chair of the Democratic National Committee's Women's Vote Center, she led the Democratic Party's initiative to reach, engage, and mobilize women voters. Please welcome to the stage, ladies and gentlemen, Ann Lewis.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you to my co-panelists, to Jackie Spear for the wonderful, wonderful work she has done in having the idea and growing this organization, to Meg Whitman for her accomplishments, for every one of you in this room. So many of you are leaders in your field, and of course to PBWC, 20 years of bringing women together so we can learn from one another. I am just honored to be with you. And I'm also happy to be here because it just seems so appropriate this year, and we have just been through an election cycle that is full of changes and possibilities for women. You've heard about the 18 million cracks in the glass ceiling. I want to give you some more numbers that are worth thinking about. First, think about the number of women voters. Women participating in the Democratic primaries went from 7.5 million in 2004 to more than 21 million in 2008. 21 million. Now, turnout as a whole went up, but women's turnout went up even more, from 54% of the electorate to 57%. And that excitement and that engagement continued. By November 2008, almost 10 million more women than men voted. 10 million. Women's giving went up. I definitely recommend you remember these numbers because they do impress people for some reason. So guaranteed to get people's attention in politics. I will tell you, for example, in the Hillary Clinton campaign, we raised $120 million, and more than half of that came from women. We raised $100 million online. 2/3 of our online donors were women. That is real power. And on the Republican side, in the month after Sarah Palin was announced as part of the Republican ticket, the Republican National Committee raised $66 million. That was their best single month ever. So again, a lot of power in those numbers. It is not just the glass ceiling that was cracked. In this election, we shattered stereotypes like what kind of man would vote for a woman. I am here to tell you, friends, that you do not win elections in Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio on the feminist vote alone. I have very good friends at Ms. Magazine, but I think if you check their subscription list, it's not big enough to carry the state. So a lot has happened in this election, and I would hope we've gotten through some of those old stereotypes. Here's another one. 1 year ago, this country was having a heated debate about gender roles and how, and even whether, women could balance work and family. Well, we've had another breakthrough. We had a presidential campaign where a sitting governor and vice presidential candidate would get off the campaign plane holding a baby, and a whole lot of politicians wanted to be in the picture with her. Now, there is a feeling of irony when I hear some of the same people who were the strongest, fiercest advocates for gender roles. You know how women staying home with the children was essential to the American Republic. They suddenly turned around and said, well, of course women can combine motherhood with holding jobs. But on balance, I welcome their conversion. It is worth celebrating that the political world now recognizes what has been a fact for so many years in women's history. Women do have families and do the work that needs to be done. So here's the bottom line, and whether you're in politics or business, that ought to be a familiar term. More women running, plus more women contributing, plus more women voting, should mean more women get elected. And whether it does or not is going to be up to you. Now, I want to keep this in perspective because we just had a year resulted in a historic number of women in the Congress. But as Jackie Spear just reminds us, that still only brings us to 17%. And as I am reminded again this week, that 17% is nothing to cheer about, but it is still twice as high as the percentage of women in the Supreme Court, in case anybody is paying attention. But we do get to this historically high number of women in Congress, and we have right now, again, slow numbers, but a historic high number of women in state legislatures, and that's very important because, of course, that is the pipeline for the next generation of women to hold federal office. I do have to say here a special shout out to New Hampshire, which became the New Hampshire State Senate this year. I know you don't often hear about New Hampshire as the source of social innovation, but New Hampshire this year became the first state legislative body to be majority female, the New Hampshire State Senate. In fact, the Democratic caucus, the Democrats are in the majority, the Democratic caucus is 11 women and 3 men. So I said to my friend who is the Senate president, "What's that like?" And she said, "We get a lot done." Now, we've got a lot to work with. So let's go forward, and in the spirit of this conference, look at the past, a vision for the future. How do we build on what we've learned? I would suggest, first, numbers matter. As I said about the bottom line, voters and money. Increased numbers should mean increased power. There is a reason why the Lilly Ledbetter Act was the first bill signed by President Obama, and you heard Jackie talk about why it was so important, and I would also add that, to my great delight, it was sponsored by Barbara Mikulski, the first woman ever elected, the first Democratic woman elected to the Senate in her own right. And to remind us all of how quickly we have made history, Barbara Mikulski got elected in 1986, just 3 years before PBWC was formed. But remember this too, political power is like any muscle. It only works if it's exercised. Second, images matter. Those images of real women running for office at the highest levels ripple throughout our system. I will never forget a woman I met who was a hairdresser in a Las Vegas hotel, and when I talked to her on caucus day, she was in tears because she could not vote, because the caucuses were in the afternoon, and if you work as a hairdresser in a Las Vegas hotel, you just can't walk out on a Saturday afternoon to go to a caucus. And she said, "I don't know how I'm going to tell my daughter that I didn't vote today." Now, I was able to tell her that the caucuses were over and the candidate she was hoping for had won. And then she said, "I'm never going to let this happen again. I am always going to vote." Well, those changes are still rippling. There's an organization I know in Washington, D.C. called Running Start that works to encourage and train young women to run for office. And every year, they work pretty hard. They have gotten traditionally 300, even 500 applications. This year, they got 30,000 applications from young women who want to come in for that training. That's very good news for where we go from here. Now, not every change is visible to the media, but I will tell you, as I traveled around the country, one thing that struck me was the number of women I met who were already holding executive office at local and community level, as mayors, as county councilors, making decisions that had to do with budgets and hiring. There is a tremendous talent pool of women who are already out there holding elected office in their communities, doing it well, ready to take to the next level. Again, they are our farm team, and we've got to be there to support them. Now, I've talked a lot about the good news, which I prefer to talk about, but I also want to be honest about one piece of, let's say, one challenge we found in 2008, and that was the extent of sexism in the media, which I suspect some of you have noticed. You know, I was ready to talk about Hillary Clinton on issues of health care, on, I don't know, foreign policy, domestic policy, the economy, the mortgage crisis. I spent more time defending her choice of jacket, or listening to the cable news complain about her voice, or responding to a Washington Post article about cleavage. You know, that was really not, I think, what the election was about. And I would say again, on the Republican side, I found the personal attacks on Sarah Palin appalling. We can go beyond that. This is about the issues.